The morning Hurricane Isabella made landfall, and our entire neighborhood was underwater except for my house, which sat completely dry behind the flood barriers that HOA President Karen Martinez had spent 6 months trying to force me to remove. I realized that sometimes the best revenge against ignorance is simply being right when it matters most. What she didn't know was that dismissing a civil engineer's flood warnings while living in Louisiana tends to create very expensive and very public lessons about respecting professional expertise. But wait until you hear what happened when Karen's unprotected house took on 8 feet of storm surge while mine stayed completely dry. The woman who'd spent months calling my flood preparations unnecessary fear-mongering discovered that arguing with hydrology engineers about hurricane science has consequences that no insurance policy can fully cover. What would you do if someone tried to stop you from protecting your family from natural disasters? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I bet your community has more respect for engineering expertise than Karen Martinez did. If you love seeing justice served when people dismiss science and safety, hit that subscribe button for more stories where expertise beats ignorance. Picture this. It's a steamy August morning in Bayou Ridge Estates, Louisiana, and I'm standing in my driveway reviewing the latest National Hurricane Center forecast, while my neighbor Karen Martinez marches across her perfectly manicured lawn with that familiar clipboard and the kind of determined expression that means she's about to make someone's day significantly worse. I'm David Thompson, 42 years old, and I work as a senior civil engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers, specializing in flood management and hurricane storm surge protection. For the past 15 years, I've designed the levee systems, pumping stations, and flood barriers that keep Louisiana communities from disappearing under the Gulf of Mexico during hurricane season. My office walls are covered with meteorological data, floodplain maps, and satellite images of storm systems that most people only see on the evening news. This morning's weather forecast showed what every engineer in Louisiana had been dreading. Hurricane Isabella, a Category 4 storm with sustained winds of 145 miles per hour, was tracking directly toward our section of the Gulf Coast. The storm surge predictions showed potential flooding of 12 to 18 feet above sea level, which would put most of our neighborhood under 8 to 10 feet of water. That's why I'd spent the previous 6 months designing and installing comprehensive flood protection for my property. My home sat behind a system of engineered barriers that could withstand storm surge up to 20 feet, integrated drainage systems that could handle extreme rainfall, and backup power systems that would keep our house operational, even during extended power outages. "David!" Karen called out as she approached, her voice carrying that particular tone of suburban authority that suggested she'd been rehearsing this confrontation. "We need to talk about your flood project." Karen Martinez was 46 years old, a real estate agent who'd lived in Louisiana for exactly 18 months after moving here from Arizona. She drove a white BMW SUV with dealer plates that never seemed to get dirty, lived in the largest house on our street, and had apparently appointed herself the neighborhood authority on property aesthetics, despite having zero experience with Gulf Coast hurricane seasons. "Good morning, Karen," I replied, folding my weather printouts and preparing for what I suspected would be another lecture about how my flood barriers affected her property values. "I've been talking to several neighbors," Karen announced, consulting her clipboard with the satisfaction of someone delivering an official verdict. "And we've decided that your flood barriers need to be removed. They're creating an atmosphere of fear and panic that's unnecessary in a modern community with proper drainage systems." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process what I'd just heard. A real estate agent who'd never experienced a Louisiana hurricane was telling a flood management engineer that flood protection was unnecessary in a state where hurricane storm surge regularly puts entire communities underwater. "Karen," I said carefully, "I'm not sure you understand the flood risks in this area. We're less than 30 miles from the Gulf Coast. Our elevation is only 8 feet above sea level, and hurricane storm surge regularly reaches 12 to 15 feet in this region." "That's exactly the kind of fear-mongering I'm talking about," Karen interrupted, with the confidence of someone who'd clearly given this speech before. "Modern drainage systems and improved levees make extreme flooding much less likely than it used to be. Your barriers are making neighbors worry unnecessarily about disasters that probably won't happen." The irony was staggering. Karen was lecturing me about flood protection while standing less than 50 feet from my home office, where I kept detailed records of every major flood event in Louisiana over the past century. She was dismissing hurricane risks while living in a state where Category 4 storms regularly cause billions of dollars in flood damage. Besides, Karen continued, warming to her theme, your barriers are unsightly and inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. Property values depend on maintaining attractive community appearance, not creating fortress-like preparations for disasters that modern engineering has made obsolete. I felt that familiar mix of professional frustration and personal anger that comes when someone dismisses expert knowledge they don't understand. Karen was essentially arguing that property aesthetics were more important than family safety, that maintaining curb appeal justified ignoring meteorological science. Karen, I work for the Army Corps of Engineers designing flood protection systems. The barriers around my house are based on 15 years of hydrology data and storm surge modeling. They are designed to protect my family from the kind of flooding that occurs here regularly during major hurricanes. Well, Karen replied with that dismissive tone people use when they've decided expertise doesn't matter. I'm sure your job gives you interesting perspectives, but I think you're overestimating the risks. Louisiana has modern infrastructure now, and catastrophic flooding isn't something homeowners need to prepare for individually. The statement was so wrong, it was almost breathtaking. Louisiana experiences some of the most severe hurricane flooding in the United States. Modern infrastructure helps, but it can't eliminate the physics of storm surge, rainfall, and elevation. Individual flood protection isn't paranoia. It's responsible preparation based on decades of meteorological data. But Karen wasn't finished with her assessment of my professional judgment. I've been researching this, she announced, pulling papers from her clipboard, and I've found several studies showing that individual flood barriers can actually increase flooding in surrounding areas by redirecting water flow. Your preparations might be making the flooding risk worse for your neighbors. I recognized the studies she was referencing. Older research about poorly designed flood barriers that didn't account for integrated drainage systems. But Karen had apparently read the abstracts without understanding the engineering principles or the design differences that made modern flood protection effective. Those studies refer to improperly designed barriers that don't include drainage integration, I explained patiently. The system around my house includes pumps, overflow channels, and permeable barriers that actually help manage water flow for the entire area. That sounds like complicated engineering theory, Karen dismissed, but the practical reality is that your barriers are making neighbors nervous and affecting property values. The HOA board has voted to require their removal within 30 days. The HOA board vote was news to me, and I suspected it was news to most of my neighbors as well. Karen had apparently decided that her opposition to flood protection represented community consensus, regardless of what other residents actually thought about hurricane preparedness. I'd like to see the meeting minutes from that board vote, I said, because I don't recall receiving notice of any meeting about flood protection policies. The board operates under emergency authority when community aesthetics are threatened, Karen replied, which was complete nonsense from a legal perspective. HOA boards can't create policies without proper notification and voting procedures, especially policies that affect individual property modifications. But Karen had clearly prepared for legal challenges to her authority. I've also consulted with the city planning office, she announced, and they've confirmed that residential flood barriers require special permits that you don't have. You're in violation of city building codes, and I'm prepared to file formal complaints if you don't voluntarily remove these structures. This was getting interesting. Karen was now making claims about building codes and permits that I knew were incorrect, because I worked directly with the city engineering office on flood management projects. She'd apparently done some research, but she'd misunderstood the regulatory framework that governs residential flood protection. Karen, I'd be very interested to know who at the city planning office told you that residential flood barriers require special permits, because that's not accurate under current Louisiana building codes. Well, that's what they told me, Karen insisted, though her tone suggested less confidence than before. Did you speak with someone in the engineering department, or did you talk to general planning staff who might not be familiar with flood protection regulations? Karen's pause suggested she hadn't spoken to anyone with actual expertise in flood management codes. Regardless, she continued, clearly wanting to move past the details of her research, The main issue is that your barriers are unnecessary and disruptive to community harmony. We live in a modern community with proper drainage and levee protection. Individual flood preparations create an atmosphere of panic that's bad for everyone's property values. I realized that Karen's opposition wasn't really about permits or water flow. It was about her fundamental disbelief that hurricane flooding posed serious risks to our community. She'd apparently convinced herself that modern infrastructure eliminated the need for individual flood protection, despite living in a state where hurricane storm surge regularly overwhelms municipal systems. Karen, I appreciate your concerns about community appearance, I said, trying one more time to explain the engineering reality. But hurricane storm surge can reach heights that overwhelm municipal drainage systems. The barriers around my house are designed to protect my family when community infrastructure isn't sufficient. That's exactly the kind of fear-based thinking I'm talking about, Karen responded with growing irritation. You're scaring neighbors with worst-case scenarios that probably won't happen. Modern levee systems and improved drainage make catastrophic flooding much less likely than historical data suggests. The conversation was becoming surreal. Karen was essentially arguing that engineering progress had eliminated weather, that modern infrastructure could control hurricane storm surge through superior design rather than meteorological reality. Besides, Karen added, clearly preparing her closing argument, even if flooding did occur, homeowners insurance and federal disaster relief would handle any damage. There's no need for individual preparations that make the whole neighborhood look like we're expecting the apocalypse. This final statement revealed the depth of Karen's misunderstanding about disaster preparedness and flood insurance. Most homeowners' insurance policies don't cover flood damage. That requires separate federal flood insurance that many people don't have. And federal disaster relief, while helpful, rarely covers the full cost of flood damage or the months of displacement that major flooding causes families. But Karen had made her position clear. She opposed flood protection based on aesthetics, property values, and her belief that modern infrastructure eliminated hurricane risks. She wanted me to remove safety systems that could protect my family's lives and property because she thought they looked bad and made neighbors unnecessarily worried about disasters. I made a decision that would prove crucial in everything that followed. Karen, I understand your concerns, but I'm not removing flood protection that's designed to keep my family safe during hurricane season. If you want to file complaints with the city or the HOA, that's your right, but I'm not compromising my family's safety for aesthetic reasons. Karen's expression shifted from the confident authority to genuine anger. Fine, she snapped, but don't expect the neighborhood to support your decision when property values start declining because of your paranoid preparations. And don't come crying to the rest of us for help when your fortress mentality creates problems for everyone else. She marched back to her house with that stiff-backed walk that suggested I'd just made a powerful enemy over what she considered unreasonable stubbornness about imaginary risks. That evening, over dinner with my wife Sandra and our twin daughters Emma and Sophia, both 14, I explained the confrontation and what it might mean for our family's relationship with the neighborhood. Mom, are we really in danger from hurricanes? Emma asked, having overheard enough of Karen's complaints to be worried about our family's safety. Sandra, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital and understood emergency preparedness from a medical perspective, answered with the calm certainty that had made me fall in love with her 16 years earlier. Emma, Sophia, your father designs flood protection systems for a living. The barriers around our house are based on scientific data about how high water can get during major storms. We're prepared, not scared. But Mrs. Martinez says we're making everyone worried for no reason, Sophia added, having apparently heard Karen's complaints during one of her neighborhood walks. Mrs. Martinez has never experienced a Louisiana hurricane, I explained. She moved here from Arizona, where flooding isn't a major concern. She doesn't understand that hurricane preparation isn't paranoia. It's responsible planning based on weather patterns that happen regularly in our state. The conversation reminded me why I'd invested so much time and money in flood protection. This wasn't about proving engineering points or winning arguments with neighbors. It was about making sure Emma and Sophia had a safe, dry home to return to after whatever storms the Gulf Coast would throw at us. Over the following weeks, Karen's campaign against my flood barriers escalated with the systematic thoroughness of someone who'd decided that winning this fight was crucial to her authority in the neighborhood. She organized what she called community education meetings at her house, where she presented research about flood insurance, drainage systems, and the psychological effects of disaster mentality on property values. I wasn't invited to these meetings, but several neighbors mentioned that Karen was actively lobbying for community pressure to force me to remove my flood protection. She began distributing flyers throughout the neighborhood, explaining why individual flood barriers were unnecessary and potentially harmful to community flood management. The flyers included selected quotes from engineering studies, carefully edited to support her argument that residential flood protection could actually increase flooding risks for surrounding properties. Most troubling, Karen started contacting my daughter's friends' parents, expressing concerns about the anxiety that our flood preparations might be causing neighborhood children. She apparently believed that seeing flood barriers made kids unnecessarily worried about hurricanes, and she wanted other parents to pressure us to remove what she called fear-inducing installations. The campaign was having some effect. Several neighbors who'd previously been friendly began treating our family with polite distance, apparently convinced by Karen's arguments that our flood preparations were selfish paranoia that threatened community property values. But Karen's most serious escalation came when she filed formal complaints with the city planning office and the parish building inspection department, claiming that our flood barriers violated multiple building codes and zoning regulations. I received official notices requiring me to appear at city planning meetings to address complaints about unpermitted residential modifications and non-compliance with community drainage standards. Karen had essentially forced me to defend my flood protection through official bureaucratic channels. The planning meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in the parish government building. I took time off from my Army Corps work to attend, bringing with me detailed engineering plans, building permits, and documentation showing that every aspect of my flood protection system complied with Louisiana building codes. Karen arrived at the meeting with a folder full of printed research and what appeared to be prepared remarks about the dangers of individual flood barriers. She'd clearly invested significant time in building her case against my flood protection. The meeting was chaired by Tom Broussard, the parish planning director, who I knew professionally through my Army Corps work on regional flood management projects. Tom had been dealing with post-hurricane reconstruction for over 20 years, and he understood the realities of Gulf Coast storm surge better than most municipal officials. Mrs. Martinez, Tom began, "You filed complaints about residential flood protection installed by your neighbor, Mr. Thompson. Can you explain your specific concerns about code compliance?" Karen launched into a 15-minute presentation about how individual flood barriers could disrupt community drainage patterns, increase flooding risks for surrounding properties, and violate parish ordinances requiring coordination of neighborhood flood management systems. Her research was impressive in its thoroughness, but it was based on fundamental misunderstandings about hydrology engineering and Louisiana building codes. She'd found legitimate studies about flood barrier design, but she'd misapplied the conclusions to my specific installation without understanding the technical differences. When Karen finished her presentation, Tom turned to me with the professional courtesy that one engineer extends to another. "David, you want to respond to these concerns?" I presented my engineering plans, building permits, and documentation showing that my flood protection system had been designed specifically to integrate with neighborhood drainage patterns rather than disrupting them. The barriers included overflow channels, integrated pumping systems, and permeable sections that actually improved water flow management for the surrounding area. More importantly, I had documentation from the Army Corps of Engineers showing that my flood protection design had been reviewed and approved by the same federal engineers who manage levee systems and storm surge protection for the entire Louisiana coast. "Tom," I concluded, "Mrs. Martinez is correct that poorly designed flood barriers can create problems for surrounding properties. But the system around my house was designed by federal flood management engineers to enhance neighborhood drainage rather than disrupting it. Every component complies with Louisiana building codes and parish flood management ordinances." Tom reviewed my documentation with the careful attention of someone who understood the engineering principles involved. "Mrs. Martinez," he said finally, Mr. Thompson's flood protection system appears to be properly designed and fully compliant with parish building codes. The complaints you've filed don't identify any actual code violations or engineering problems. Karen's face went through several expressions as she realized her bureaucratic challenge had failed. But what about the community impact? She pressed. What about the effect on property values and neighborhood anxiety? Ma'am, parish building codes don't regulate property aesthetics or neighborhood psychology. If Mr. Thompson's flood barriers comply with engineering and safety requirements, that's the extent of our regulatory authority. The meeting ended with Karen's complaints dismissed and my flood protection officially validated by parish engineering review. But I knew this wouldn't be the end of Karen's campaign against what she saw as unnecessary disaster preparations. I was right. Over the following month, Karen escalated her efforts to pressure me into removing my flood barriers through social and economic means, rather than regulatory challenges. She organized a neighborhood petition claiming that my flood protection was harming community property values and requesting voluntary removal for the good of all residents. The petition gained some signatures from neighbors who'd been convinced by Karen's arguments about modern drainage systems eliminating flooding risks. She contacted local real estate agents, asking them to assess whether visible flood barriers would affect home sales in our neighborhood. Several agents, apparently influenced by Karen's presentation about disaster mentality, suggested that flood preparations might indeed make potential buyers worry unnecessarily about hurricane risks. Most seriously, Karen began spreading rumors that my flood barriers were actually illegal under federal flood insurance regulations, and that neighbors with standard homeowners insurance might face coverage problems if flooding occurred due to my non-compliant modifications. This last claim was completely false and potentially damaging to my professional reputation. Federal flood insurance regulations actually encourage individual flood protection measures that reduce damage risks. But Karen's misinformation was creating genuine worry among neighbors about their insurance coverage. I decided it was time to address Karen's campaign directly. I organized my own neighborhood meeting, inviting all residents to hear a presentation about hurricane flood risks, the engineering principles behind effective flood protection, and the actual regulatory framework governing residential flood management. The meeting was held on a Wednesday evening in the community center, with about 30 neighbors attending. Karen was present, sitting in the front row with her familiar clipboard and a determined expression. I presented meteorological data showing hurricane frequency and storm surge heights along the Louisiana coast over the past 50 years. I explained how storm surge works, why elevation matters, and how even modern drainage systems can be overwhelmed during major hurricanes. I showed engineering diagrams of my flood protection system, explaining how the barriers were designed to protect not just my property, but to improve water flow management for the surrounding area. I detailed the permits, inspections, and Army Corps review that had validated every aspect of the installation. Most importantly, I addressed Karen's misinformation about insurance regulations, federal compliance, and the supposed risks of individual flood protection to community flood management. I want everyone to understand, I concluded, that flood protection isn't about fear or paranoia. It's about responsible preparation based on meteorological data and engineering science. Hurricane storm surge is a predictable phenomenon, and preparing for it protects families and reduces the burden on emergency services during disasters. During the question period, several neighbors asked technical questions about flood risks, drainage systems, and the effectiveness of individual protection measures. Karen remained silent until near the end of the meeting. "David," she said finally, "I appreciate all this technical information, but I think you're missing the bigger picture. We chose to live in this neighborhood because of its modern infrastructure and professional management. Residents shouldn't have to become amateur engineers or invest thousands of dollars in individual flood protection. That's what municipal systems are for. Karen, municipal flood protection is designed to handle normal flooding conditions. But major hurricanes can produce storm surge that exceeds the capacity of any drainage system. Individual protection isn't about replacing municipal systems. It's about preparing for the extreme conditions that overwhelm community infrastructure." "But if everyone starts building individual flood barriers," Karen pressed, "we'll have a neighborhood that looks like a disaster zone, even when there's no disaster. Property values will decline, New families won't want to move here and will have created the very problems we're trying to avoid. This was the heart of Karen's opposition. She believed that preparing for disasters would attract disasters, that visible flood protection would somehow manifest the flooding we were preparing for. It was magical thinking applied to meteorological science. The meeting ended with most neighbors expressing appreciation for the technical information, but no clear resolution to the underlying conflict between Karen's aesthetic concerns and my family's safety preparations. That resolution would come from Mother Nature herself, exactly 6 weeks later, when Hurricane Isabella made landfall as a Category 4 storm with sustained winds of 145 miles per hour and storm surge reaching 16 feet above sea level. I knew Isabella was going to be serious 3 days before landfall, when the National Hurricane Center issued its first storm surge warnings for our section of the Louisiana coast. The predicted surge heights of 12 to 18 feet would put our neighborhood under 8 to 10 feet of water, exactly the scenario my flood barriers had been designed to handle. On the morning of evacuation orders, I made final preparations to our flood protection system, checking pumps, securing overflow channels, and activating backup power systems that would keep our equipment operational during extended power outages. Most of our neighbors were evacuating to inland shelters or staying with relatives in higher elevation areas. My family chose to shelter in place, confident in our flood protection, but prepared for the possibility that even engineered systems can fail under extreme conditions. Karen Martinez was among the last to evacuate, and I noticed her looking at my flood barriers with what might have been the first doubt I'd seen her express about dismissing hurricane preparations. "David," she called across her yard as she loaded luggage into her BMW, "are you sure about staying here? The Weather Service is predicting really serious flooding." "We're prepared, Karen. The barriers are designed to handle storm surge higher than what Isabella is predicted to produce. But you should get to higher ground. Your house doesn't have flood protection." "The drainage system should handle it," she replied, but her tone suggested less confidence than usual. "Modern infrastructure is designed for these kinds of storms." I didn't have the heart to explain that no drainage system can handle 16 feet of storm surge. Municipal flood management is designed for heavy rainfall and minor coastal flooding, not the kind of catastrophic storm surge that major hurricanes can push inland. Hurricane Isabella made landfall at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning with winds that sounded like freight trains and storm surge that began flooding our neighborhood within an hour of the eye wall passing over us. From my second-floor windows, I watched our street transform into a river as storm surge flowed inland from the Gulf Coast. The water rose steadily throughout the morning, reaching depths of 8 feet in the street and surrounding every house in the neighborhood except ours. Our flood barriers held perfectly, diverting storm surge around our property while our integrated pumping systems managed the overflow. Our house remained completely dry, our power stayed on through backup systems, and our family rode out the storm in comfort while the rest of the neighborhood disappeared under several feet of floodwater. The view from our dry second floor was both vindicate and heartbreaking. Every house visible from our windows was flooded, with water reaching first-floor windows and families' belongings floating in what had been their front yards just hours earlier. Karen Martinez's house, which sat at slightly lower elevation than ours and lacked any flood protection, had taken on nearly 10 feet of water. Her white BMW was completely submerged in her driveway, and storm surge had clearly reached the second floor of her home. The flooding persisted for nearly 18 hours after the storm passed, as overwhelmed drainage systems slowly processed the massive amount of water that Isabella had pushed inland. During those long hours, our house stood like an island of normalcy, surrounded by a disaster zone that extended as far as we could see. When the water finally receded enough for emergency responders to reach our neighborhood, the extent of the devastation became clear. Every house on our street except ours had suffered major flood damage, with most families facing months of reconstruction and tens of thousands of dollars in water damage that flood insurance would only partially cover. The first knock on our door came from a Red Cross volunteer who was conducting wellness checks on neighborhood residents. "Sir, we're checking on families who might need emergency assistance," she said, clearly surprised to find us dry and comfortable, while the rest of the neighborhood dealt with flood damage. "We're fine," I replied. "Our flood protection systems worked as designed. Do you need us to help with other families who weren't as prepared?" Over the following days, our house became an unofficial coordination center for neighborhood recovery efforts. Families whose homes were uninhabitable needed places to charge phones, access internet, and coordinate with insurance adjusters and contractors. We had power, clean water, and dry space that other neighbors desperately needed. Karen Martinez returned to the neighborhood 4 days after the storm, and the devastation to her house was severe. The first floor was completely destroyed, with water damage extending into the second floor. Her furniture, electronics, and personal belongings were either destroyed or severely damaged by floodwater that had reached nearly ceiling height. I was in my front yard, helping coordinate electrical repairs for neighbors whose flood-damaged homes needed rewiring, when Karen approached me for the first time since the storm. "David," she said quietly, her voice lacking the confident authority I'd grown accustomed to hearing, "I owe you an apology." I looked up from the electrical diagrams I'd been reviewing with a contractor who was helping restore power to damaged homes. "Karen, I'm sorry about your house. I know this is devastating for your family." "I was wrong," she continued, her words coming slowly as if she was still processing what had happened. "I was completely wrong about everything. The flood barriers, the storm surge predictions, the risks to our neighborhood. Everything you tried to warn me about happened exactly like you said it would." I could see the weight of realization in her expression, the understanding that her opposition to flood protection hadn't been based on superior knowledge or reasonable skepticism, but on fundamental misunderstanding of meteorological science and engineering reality. "I spent 6 months trying to force you to remove the systems that kept your family safe, while mine was completely unprepared for something that you knew was inevitable," Karen said, shaking her head at her own previous certainty. The conversation was interrupted by a contractor who needed my input on electrical repairs for a neighbor's flooded house, but Karen's acknowledgement of her mistakes was the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately help other families prepare for the hurricane seasons that Louisiana faces every year. Over the following weeks, as our neighborhood slowly recovered from Hurricane Isabella's devastation, Karen became one of the most vocal advocates for residential flood protection in our community. She started attending parish planning meetings, advocating for policies that would encourage rather than restrict individual flood preparation measures. She worked with the local emergency management office to develop educational programs about hurricane preparedness and flood protection options for homeowners. Most importantly, Karen used her own experience to educate other communities about the importance of respecting engineering expertise and meteorological science when making decisions about disaster preparedness. "I learned through losing almost everything I owned," Karen would tell audiences of homeowners and HOA boards, "that aesthetic concerns and property values mean nothing when your house is underwater. Engineering expertise exists to protect families from predictable natural disasters, and dismissing that expertise because you don't like how flood barriers look is potentially catastrophic." The federal disaster relief and insurance process validated everything I'd tried to explain to Karen before the storm. Families with proper flood insurance and flood protection recovered much faster and with much less financial devastation than families who had relied solely on municipal systems and disaster relief. Our house, which had remained completely dry during the storm, required no flood-related repairs and no displacement of our family. Our neighbors, many of whom were still living in temporary housing 6 months after the storm, began asking detailed questions about residential flood protection and engineering consulting for their reconstruction projects. The Army Corps of Engineers used our neighborhood as a case study for individual flood protection effectiveness, documenting how properly designed residential barriers could complement municipal flood management systems rather than conflicting with them. But perhaps the most meaningful vindication came 18 months later, when Karen Martinez completed reconstruction of her house with comprehensive flood protection designed using the same engineering principles that had kept our family safe. "David," she said during the installation of her new flood barriers, "I want you to know that I'll never again dismiss expert knowledge because I don't understand it or because I don't like its implications. Your flood protection didn't just save your house. It taught the whole neighborhood about respecting science and preparing responsibly for predictable risks." Today, our neighborhood has become a model for individual flood protection integrated with community drainage systems. Most families have installed some form of flood barrier, and the neighborhood association now requires new residents to attend educational sessions about hurricane preparedness and flood protection options. Karen Martinez serves as the volunteer coordinator for neighborhood emergency preparedness, working with parish emergency management and the National Weather Service to ensure that families understand flood risks and have access to engineering consultation for residential protection systems. The transformation has been remarkable, from a community that dismissed flood protection as unnecessary paranoia to a neighborhood that's become a regional example of effective hurricane preparedness through individual responsibility and professional engineering expertise. But the long-term impact of Hurricane Isabella extended far beyond our immediate neighborhood. The storm's devastation throughout Louisiana prompted statewide policy changes regarding residential flood protection and community disaster preparedness. The Louisiana Department of Emergency Management commissioned a comprehensive study of individual flood protection effectiveness during Hurricane Isabella, using our neighborhood as the primary case study. The research documented how properly designed residential flood barriers could protect individual families while enhancing rather than interfering with community-wide flood management systems. The study's findings led to the Louisiana Individual Flood Protection Act, legislation that established state standards for residential flood barriers and created tax incentives for homeowners who invested in qualifying flood protection systems. The law also prohibited HOA boards and municipal authorities from restricting residential flood protection that met engineering standards and building code requirements. I was invited to testify before the Louisiana legislature during consideration of the Individual Flood Protection Act, representing homeowners who had successfully protected their families through individual engineering solutions during major hurricane events. Hurricane Isabella proved that individual flood protection isn't about fear or paranoia, I told the legislative committee reviewing the proposed law. It's about engineering reality and meteorological science. Storm surge follows physics, not wishful thinking, and families who prepare appropriately can survive and recover when community infrastructure is overwhelmed by extreme weather. The legislation passed unanimously and became a model for similar laws in other hurricane-prone states throughout the Gulf Coast and Atlantic seaboard. Federal emergency management agencies began promoting individual flood protection as a complement to community flood management systems, rather than a replacement for municipal infrastructure. Karen's transformation became equally comprehensive during this period. She completed certification as a Community Emergency Response Team Coordinator, specializing in flood preparedness education and residential protection consulting. Her personal experience with Hurricane Isabella, combined with her previous opposition to flood protection, made her an unusually effective advocate for disaster preparedness. I have unique credibility when I talk to homeowners who are skeptical about flood protection, Karen explained during one of her community presentations. I can honestly say that I was wrong about everything: the risks, the engineering, the effectiveness of individual barriers. I lost almost everything I owned because I dismissed expert knowledge and prioritized aesthetic concerns over family safety. Her presentations typically included before and after photos of our neighborhood during Hurricane Isabella, showing the dramatic difference between houses with flood protection and those without. The visual impact of our dry home, surrounded by flooded properties, provided compelling evidence that individual preparation could make the difference between family safety and disaster. Karen also worked with insurance companies to develop flood protection assessment programs, helping homeowners understand how individual barriers could reduce insurance premiums while providing superior protection compared to standard flood insurance coverage alone. The insurance partnerships proved particularly valuable for convincing budget-conscious homeowners that flood protection was economically sensible as well as safety-focused. Many families discovered that the long-term savings in insurance premiums could offset much of the initial investment in flood barriers. 5 years after Hurricane Isabella, our neighborhood hosted the first annual Louisiana Individual Flood Protection Conference, bringing together engineers, emergency management officials, insurance representatives, and homeowners from throughout the Gulf Coast region. The conference featured technical presentations on residential flood barrier design, case studies from communities that had successfully implemented individual protection programs, and policy discussions about integrating residential systems with municipal flood management infrastructure. But the most powerful presentations came from families who had experienced major hurricanes both before and after installing individual flood protection. Their firsthand accounts of the difference that proper preparation made during actual storm events provided emotional validation for the engineering principles that flood protection represents. Emma and Sophia, now 18 years old and preparing for college, participated in the conference as youth advocates for disaster preparedness education. Their presentation, titled Growing Up Protected: How Engineering Science Shapes Family Security, addressed the psychological and educational benefits that children experience when families prioritize evidence-based preparation over wishful thinking. Living with flood protection taught us that respecting expertise and preparing for predictable risks aren't signs of anxiety or pessimism, Emma told the conference audience. They're signs of intelligence and responsibility. We learned early that science exists to protect people and that dismissing expert knowledge because you don't like its implications creates preventable suffering. Sophia added, "Our house stayed dry during Hurricane Isabella because our parents respected meteorological science and engineering expertise. Other families in our neighborhood suffered preventable damage because they chose to believe that modern infrastructure could control weather patterns. The difference wasn't luck, it was preparation based on professional knowledge." The conference concluded with the announcement of the National Individual Flood Protection Research Center, a joint project between Louisiana State University, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The research center would develop improved residential flood protection technologies while documenting best practices for community-wide disaster preparedness programs. I was appointed as the center's founding director, a position that allowed me to expand individual flood protection research beyond Louisiana to hurricane-vulnerable communities throughout the United States. The research center's first major project involved documenting individual flood protection effectiveness during Hurricane Isabella and subsequent major storms throughout the Gulf Coast region. The data confirmed that properly designed residential barriers could reduce flood damage by 85 to 95%. Compared to homes that relied solely on community infrastructure and flood insurance. More importantly, the research demonstrated that individual flood protection reduced the burden on emergency services during major hurricane events, freeing up rescue resources for families who hadn't prepared adequately or faced unexpected equipment failures. The center also developed standardized design guidelines for residential flood barriers, making effective protection more accessible to families without engineering backgrounds. The guidelines included detailed specifications for different flood risk levels, integrated drainage systems, and backup power requirements. But perhaps the most significant research finding involved the psychological and community benefits of individual flood protection. Families with effective flood barriers showed reduced anxiety about hurricane seasons, increased community engagement during storm preparation periods, and greater willingness to help neighbors who were less prepared for major weather events. The research validated something that our neighborhood had discovered through direct experience. Individual preparation for predictable risks creates stronger, more resilient communities rather than undermining community solidarity. Today, 10 years after Hurricane Isabella, over 40% of Louisiana homes in hurricane-vulnerable areas have some form of individual flood protection. Property values in protected neighborhoods actually exceed values in areas that rely solely on community infrastructure, contradicting Karen's original arguments about flood barriers reducing real estate desirability. The transformation has been so comprehensive that new residents moving to Louisiana, coastal communities, routinely ask about flood protection options during home purchasing negotiations. Real estate agents now market individual flood barriers as premium features that increase property values rather than aesthetic problems that reduce marketability. But the most profound changes have occurred in community disaster preparedness culture throughout Louisiana and other Gulf Coast states. Hurricane Isabella became a case study in the importance of respecting engineering expertise and meteorological science when making decisions about family safety and community resilience. The Louisiana Department of Emergency Management now requires all coastal communities to provide flood protection education to residents, including information about individual flood barriers, community drainage integration, and the engineering principles behind effective storm surge management. Similar education programs have been implemented in Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, all based on lessons learned from our neighborhood's experience with Hurricane Isabella and the community transformation that followed Karen's initial opposition to flood protection. The National Weather Service has incorporated individual flood protection advocacy into its hurricane preparedness messaging, emphasizing that residential flood barriers complement rather than replace community infrastructure and emergency planning. FEMA has developed standardized guidelines for residential flood protection, making effective systems more accessible to homeowners throughout hurricane-vulnerable regions. The guidelines include detailed specifications for different risk levels, cost-benefit analyses for various protection options, and integration requirements for community-wide flood management. But perhaps most importantly, Hurricane Isabella changed how engineering expertise is perceived and valued in disaster-prone communities. The storm demonstrated that technical knowledge exists to protect families from predictable natural phenomena, and that dismissing expertise based on aesthetic preferences or wishful thinking creates preventable suffering. Professional engineering organizations now use our neighborhood's story as a case study in community education, showing how individual technical expertise can benefit entire communities when properly applied and respected. Universities throughout the Gulf Coast region have developed research programs focusing on residential flood protection and community resilience, building on the engineering principles and community psychology lessons that Hurricane Isabella demonstrated. The Storm Surge Research Institute at Louisiana State University, where I now serve as Director of Community Resilience Programs, continues studying the intersection of individual preparation and community-wide disaster management. Our research has documented similar patterns in communities throughout hurricane-vulnerable regions. Families who prepare appropriately for predictable risks become community resources during disaster response and recovery. Emma and Sophia, now working as environmental engineers specializing in climate adaptation technologies, credit their childhood experience with Hurricane Isabella for shaping their professional dedication to disaster preparedness and community resilience. Growing up in a house that stayed dry while the neighborhood flooded taught us that engineering knowledge exists to protect people from predictable natural disasters. Emma explained during a recent interview about her work developing improved residential flood protection systems. We saw firsthand how respecting expertise and preparing appropriately could make the difference between family safety and preventable suffering. Sophia, who specializes in community-wide flood management integration, added, "Hurricane Isabella also taught us that individual preparation and community solidarity aren't opposites. They're complementary approaches to resilience. Families who prepare appropriately for predictable risks become resources for neighbors who need help, rather than burdens on emergency services." Both daughters have worked on flood protection projects throughout the United States and internationally, applying lessons learned from Hurricane Isabella to help communities prepare for predictable natural disasters while building social cohesion rather than individual isolation. Karen Martinez, now 56 and recognized as one of Louisiana's leading disaster preparedness advocates, frequently speaks about the importance of respecting expertise and evidence-based decision-making when confronting predictable natural disasters. "I learned through losing almost everything I owned that aesthetic concerns and property values mean nothing when physics takes over during major storm events," she tells audiences of homeowners, emergency managers, and policymakers. Individual flood protection isn't about fear or paranoia. It's about intelligent preparation based on meteorological science and engineering expertise. Her presentations always include the fundamental lesson that Hurricane Isabella taught our entire community. Weather doesn't respect personal beliefs, property values, or community confidence. Storm surge follows physics, and families who prepare for that reality survive and recover, while families who don't face preventable devastation. Karen's transformation has been so complete that she now serves on the Louisiana Emergency Management Agency's Community Preparedness Advisory Board, helping develop policies that encourage individual flood protection while ensuring integration with community-wide disaster planning. She also works with insurance companies throughout the Gulf Coast region, helping them understand how individual flood protection reduces claim costs while providing superior family safety compared to standard flood insurance coverage alone. But perhaps Karen's most important contribution has been her willingness to acknowledge mistakes and help other communities avoid the opposition to engineering expertise that nearly prevented our neighborhood from preparing appropriately for Hurricane Isabella. I want every community leader to understand that dismissing expert knowledge because you don't like its implications or because you prioritize short-term aesthetics over long-term safety can cost families everything they own, Karen explains during her presentations to HOA boards and municipal planning groups. Hurricane Isabella taught me that respecting engineering expertise isn't about giving up community authority. It's about using the best available knowledge to protect the people you serve. Technical knowledge exists to prevent predictable suffering, not to create unnecessary anxiety. Today, 15 years after Hurricane Isabella, our neighborhood serves as a permanent demonstration site for residential flood protection, integrated with community disaster preparedness. Delegations from communities throughout the United States and internationally visit Bayou Ridge Estates to study how individual engineering solutions can enhance rather than undermine community resilience. The demonstration site includes our original flood barriers, which have now protected our family through 4 major hurricanes and countless tropical storms. The systems require regular maintenance and occasional upgrades, but they've provided consistent protection while saving tens of thousands of dollars in potential flood damage and insurance claims. More importantly, the demonstration site shows visitors how individual flood protection changes community dynamics during hurricane events. Instead of evacuating or hoping for emergency rescue, families with effective flood barriers can shelter safely while remaining available to help neighbors who need assistance during storm recovery. The site also demonstrates the economic benefits of individual flood protection over time. Our neighborhood property values have increased faster than comparable communities without flood protection, and insurance premiums for protected homes continue declining as flood risk data validates the effectiveness of individual barriers. Sandra, now working as a disaster preparedness consultant for hospital systems throughout Louisiana, credits Hurricane Isabella with teaching our family that expertise exists to protect people, not to create problems. David's flood barriers didn't just save our house, she explains to medical professionals learning about disaster preparedness. They taught our entire family that respecting scientific knowledge and preparing appropriately for predictable risks creates security rather than anxiety. That lesson has influenced how we approach every aspect of our lives, from health decisions to financial planning. The comprehensive transformation of our community, from flood protection opposition to regional leadership in disaster preparedness, demonstrates that technical expertise, when properly communicated and respectfully applied, can create community benefits that extend far beyond individual family safety. Emma and Sophia, now 16 years old, have grown up understanding that respecting expertise and preparing for predictable risks aren't signs of fear or paranoia. They're signs of intelligence and responsibility. They've seen firsthand how engineering knowledge can protect families when natural disasters overwhelm community infrastructure. When Emma studies meteorology at school and learns about hurricane formation, she knows that her family's flood protection represents applied science rather than expensive anxiety. When Sophia sees news about hurricane damage in other communities, she understands that preparation and prevention are always more effective than reaction and recovery. And when Sandra and I talk to other families about choosing homes in hurricane-prone areas, we tell them about Bayou Ridge Estates, not the neighborhood that initially dismissed flood protection as unnecessary, but the community that learned to respect meteorological science and engineering expertise through direct experience with natural disaster reality. Hurricane Isabella taught us that nature doesn't respect property aesthetics, municipal confidence, or personal beliefs about disaster probability. Storm surge follows physics, not wishful thinking, and preparing for predictable weather phenomena protects families while failing to prepare creates preventable devastation. More importantly, Isabella demonstrated that expertise exists for reasons beyond professional ego or bureaucratic control. Civil engineers design flood protection systems, because hurricanes regularly produce storm surge that overwhelms community infrastructure. Dismissing that expertise because you don't like its implications or understand its necessity creates consequences that no amount of regret can undo. Federal meteorological science now provides hurricane predictions, accurate enough to allow effective preparation for families willing to respect expertise and invest in protection systems. Community infrastructure helps, but individual responsibility for predictable risks ensures that families can survive and recover when municipal systems are overwhelmed by extreme weather conditions. The smell of victory, as it turns out, smells exactly like dry homes after major storms. The comfort of families who prepared appropriately for predictable risks, rather than hoping that modern infrastructure could control weather patterns through superior engineering confidence. What's your worst HOA horror story? Drop it in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else going through the same battle. Hit that subscribe button if you love seeing bullies get what they deserve, and ring that notification bell for more HOA Revenge Stories, where justice is served ice cold. Remember, sometimes standing up to neighborhood tyrants doesn't just save yourself, it saves everyone around you. When good people refuse to be intimidated by fake authority, entire communities can break free from fear. Thanks for watching HOA Revenge Stories, where we prove that every HOA Karen eventually meets their match.